Well, welcome back to our final lesson in programming your child for success. I hope so far that you've gotten something out of this. I just wanted to say that it's my honor and privilege to share this information with you. So I hope it's been a blessing to you. And in this last lesson, I want to share some final thoughts, some fill in the blanks, kind of fill in the cracks, and a little bit more information about how to apply this process that we've been talking about programming your child, your child's heart. So we talked a couple lessons ago about creating behavior. So I want to start out talking about how to turn negative behavior into positive, because that's what you're going to be doing. Remember, we talked about seeing the facts, but then speaking the truth. And so I just wanted to start with a caution about negative statements. Okay, it's so automatic as a parent to say no, don't, stop, and we use those kinds of directives automatically all the time, and most of the time it's because we're trying to protect our children. But when we use those negative corrections, what happens is the child hears there's something wrong with me, I'm not accepted because what I'm doing, she's saying no, don't. Or they feel like I'm not good enough, or I'm not good, or I'm not able. So we want to be able to, instead of saying no, don't do that, we want to then be able to turn that into a positive correction where we rather focus on what we want them to do. So instead of saying, don't take that, don't play with that, or if they're reaching for something that isn't a toy, say, here, let's play with this. It's a simple concept, but it's not as easy in the moment to apply it. So I wanted to look at just some hypothetical scenarios and some possible positive responses. So let's say, for example, your child's banging on the table during a meal, and you say, stop banging on the table. See, we say things like that all the time, right? Well, instead of saying stop banging on the table, because you're defining the wrong or the what you don't want, then instead of saying what you don't want and judging that and condemning that, which is what you're doing when you say don't do that, the implication is I don't want you to do that. It's not acceptable. That's unacceptable behavior. So then you're placing a judgment on their behavior that's negative. So rather than doing that, say what you want. Create life by speaking what you want and creating the behavior you want. So, and rather than condemning the past, create the future. That's how I summarize this concept. So instead of saying stop banging the table, you would say something like, we sit quietly at the table. And so what you're doing is you're just stating the standard or the expectation. And that becomes a very objective statement that isn't really directed at the child. So when you say stop doing something, you're directing that statement to them. But when you say we sit quietly at the table, you're just stating a rule or a standard or an expectation. So it kind of takes that accusatory tone off of it, and you're being positive and you're creating what you want. And remember, when you say these kind of things to young children, what you're doing is you're programming him to understand what you expect, what you want. We sit quietly at the table, okay? So you might have to say that a couple of times before it sticks and he begins to just automatically be quiet at the table. And then you may just, have to say, sitting quietly or sit quietly after that until it sticks. But again, it doesn't really take long. If you start this when kids are young, it doesn't, you'll be amazed. They're so easy to program. Or you could say, excuse me, I love how you sit quietly at the table. Now, this is difficult. Remember, I talked about the father who was telling his daughter how he loved she was gentle with the cat while she was in the middle of roughing up the cat. Yeah, it feels very awkward. But again, to walk in the Spirit, we have to crucify our flesh. We have to deny that natural tendency of the flesh to identify and condemn the behavior we don't want. And so it's going to feel awkward, more awkward to say something like, I love how you sit quietly at the table, while your child's sitting there banging on the table. It's easier to say things like, we sit quietly at the table. But you want to transition into those more powerful statements, like speaking right into the face of that giant, like, you know, your child just being an ogre at the table, and you look at it and you go, I love how you sit quietly at the table. And it's powerful because it takes them aback, and they're like, oh, I sit quietly at the table, because you're telling them you sit quietly at the table. But it's difficult because it feels so counterintuitive. But try it, and that's the goal. You want to get to the point where you can look past the facts and speak the truth of who they really are, because remember, God created them in his image, and God doesn't bang on the table and disrupt meals. So here's another example. Don't hit your sister, okay? I love this one because it was such a great teaching moment, especially when it's an interaction with another person, because here you have an opportunity to teach your child, to program your child, caught myself, to train him and to be, kind to other people. And so that was a problem I had a lot with my kids. I had kind of sets of children, like two, two, two. And so they always had their rival, their chosen rival, their favorite rival in the family. And so, there was a lot of bickering. I had a lot of girls in a row, and they liked to petty fight a lot. And so, grabbing and pushing and whatever, that happened a lot. And so I had a lot of opportunities, and I would say to them, I'd gently take their hands and I'd say, hands are for helping and people are for loving. Think about what you're programming into your child when you say something like that, instead of don't hit your sister or don't grab a toy. Hands are for helping and people are for loving. And, they respond to that. They can't really argue with that. And they may complain, say, well, she did this, blah, blah, blah. Yes, and I'm so glad that you use your hands for loving and that you're so helpful. So I'll do another series on sibling rivalry, because there's so much you can teach your kids in those trials that they have, those conflicts they have with each other. Another thing you can say is, I like how you're so kind to your sister. So however you want to say it, remember, you are creating. You're not defining the wrong, which is what the law does, and that brings judgment. You're creating, you're speaking life and creating the behavior that you want. So even when they're not being kind, you are so kind to your sister. Thank you for being kind with your sister. And sometimes, a lot of times, when there's two kids involved, there's physical intervention by the parent, but it's very gentle. I would come over and I would just gently take their hands, and I would say, if they're grabbing or they're putting, you want to separate them. Hands are for helping, people are for loving. Thank you for being kind to your sister, and just speaking life over them. Last example on this, don't climb on the couch. Stop climbing on the couch. I told you 100 times not to jump on the couch. It's amazing to me how many parents have that problem. They call it a problem. I don't know. I always thought kids jumping on the couch was a good thing. They love to jump on the bed and all that kind of stuff. But I guess I was kind of an atypical parent, where I saw the beauty in things like that. They were being kids, enjoying life and discovering their abilities. And jumping's a good thing. So, but anyway, you could, instead of saying don't climb on the couch or don't jump on the couch, thank you for sitting nicely on the couch. Or here's another good example, because when you see a child doing something you don't want, there's nothing morally wrong with jumping on a couch. It's not like your child is being bad. We call it misbehavior because we've told them not to. But jumping on something is actually, developmentally, it is good for a child to jump. And so what you want to do is identify the good in what they're doing rather than condemning it as bad. Most of what we call bad behavior is just childish. It's kids being kids. And in this Western world we live in, life has become so polished and contained, and that kids really don't get a chance to run wild like they used to do in the old days. I grew up even, just a few decades ago, where we ran outside all day unsupervised, ran through the neighborhood. Nowadays, kids aren't allowed to do that for safety. And sure, there's parts of the world, maybe small towns where they still do that, but for the most part, you know, kids aren't allowed to run wild, so they don't get the natural opportunities that they really need to have a healthy physical exertion, the physical exertion that they crave. So jumping on things, you know, we don't like that, but something that you could say when your child is doing something like this and you recognize that he is just exerting energy, and that's a good thing, is you can say, you are such a good jumper, or you're such a good climber if they're climbing on things. How about we go to the park after lunch and climb on the jungle gym, or, you know, or get him a mini tramp and let him jump on the mini tramp. But it's good to look at the behavior and just stop and ask yourself, why is my child doing this? He's not being defiant. He's just being a child. Remember, they're impulsive. They live in the moment. They're not thinking about what they're going to do. They don't remember what you told them. And even if they did, the impulse takes over. They see something, they feel like jumping, so they jump. You know, it's just a kid being a kid. So redirecting that positive behavior to something that's acceptable to you is another option. I heard a story recently about a girl who brought home her report card, and she was in the younger grades. You know, it was more like a progress report. And the teacher said she gets distracted in large groups. And the child started to defend herself and say, well, yes, I do get distracted, but, and her mother interrupted her and said, you know what? Oh, I know what it said. It said she looks around. The daughter said, I do look around a lot in the groups. And the mother said, oh, yes. And because you always look around, you notice people and you notice their needs. And she started going down a list of times that she knew of when her daughter had noticed, because of her bad behavior of looking around in large groups and not paying attention to the teacher. She noticed when someone was left out and she befriended them. She said, you noticed when grandfather walked slower and you slowed down for him. And she started listing all these times where her daughter's looking around was not a bad thing. It was actually a good thing. And so to me, I just think that story exemplifies what we call bad behavior, what school calls bad behavior, isn't always necessarily a bad thing. A lot of times it's a good trait that we just don't want to be happening at that time. So I think I'm going to stop here because that's a nice little kind of concept we've gone over. And I lied. This isn't the last video. I'll do another one and share a few more odds and ends before we end our series. So until then, take care and God bless. See you in the next video.